Poiwil thil squalawal quils quitslala chochat thal squeak talitzel qua scaukeo casta stalis casta homathquium shaishkuit casta huliho tol squalis thil shwali chochat squeak thil Cecila. I'm happy to be here to share the mosquito story. It was originally told by my great-grandmother, Sophie Felix. Her traditional name was Chochat, and my auntie Maxine Prevost carried that name, and it was also passed down to me, so I carry this name as well, Chochat. I'm from Scoutkill First Nation, Chehalis and Musqueam, and my parents are Stephen and Gwen Point. Their traditional names are Shaishkoit and Hulihuoto. So it was a hot summer day, and two young boys were out playing at the slough throwing rocks, and they're trying to see who could throw the rock the furthest. And their names are James and George. And they're sitting there throwing the rocks, and James said, "Did you bring the bread and the fish?" And George said, "Yeah, I have it here." They sat down and they ate. As the day went on, James said, "Well, we better get going. It's getting late." And George said, "Well, I'm full after we ate. Let's just rest for a little while." And before James knew, George was shaking him. And George is saying, "James, it's dark, James. It's getting dark." And James woke up, and they got up on their bikes and they went riding home. And they knew they missed supper. And they walked in, and their mom was waiting for them. And she was disappointed because they were always told to come home when the sun starts going down. Their mom said, "Well, you better go see your grandma. She's in the living room." And they knew they were going to get a good talking to too. So they walked in, and she was sitting in there, and they sat down, and she looked at them, and she said, "You know, the kids are always told to come home when the sun starts going down." And the boys were listening. And she said, "I'll tell you why. It was not long ago, there were children, and they were playing by the river just like you kids were. And they were swimming and coming in and out of the water all day. And they started to lay down, and they got tired. Before you knew it, one of the young boys, he was being woken up by one of the younger kids, and they looked up and they could see Thuchwea coming from the distance. They say she was fast as lightning, and she was picking up the kids. She had a basket on her back. In our language, we say sito for basket. And she picked up the kids, and she was putting them in her basket. And before they knew it, she was running up the mountain with the kids in the basket. And the kids started to cry. One of the young boys, he had a clamshell from the river, and he was sitting there, and he started to scrape at the bottom of the basket. He was scraping. Before you knew it, there's a hole, and he fell through the hole. And Thuchwea said, "Quum quum, what's that noise?" And she looked around, and the boy, he rolled in behind the bush, and he laid there. Well, three more of the kids, they dropped through the basket, and she heard it. She said, "Quum quum quotha, what's that noise?" And the kids were hiding. They thought they were all gonna get away, but the next boy that was sitting at the bottom, he had a hunchback. And what our elders tell us is that they always tell us when somebody's speaking, you have to sit up, or else that's what will happen to you. And that young boy, he never sat up when his elders were talking to him. He came to the bottom of the basket, and he couldn't fit through the hole, so they were stuck in the basket. And the kids started to cry. And before you knew it, Thuchwea made it all the way up to the top of the mountain. When Thuchwea finally got home with the kids in their basket, she sat them all down, and she said, "Oh, Emeth, oh, my grandchildren." She always called the children that she stole her grandchildren. She said, "Sit down here." She sat them all down, and she put a pole in front of them. and she gave them all sticks. The oldest boy said, "What are these for, grandmother?" And she said, "Oh, Emeth, you're gonna sing for me. I'm gonna dance and you're gonna sing." Then Thukwia, she went and collected some pitch from a spruce tree. And she came back, and one of the oldest boy, he was watching her. He figured she was going to put the pitch on their eyes so that they couldn't see her. So he leaned over to the younger child. He said, "When she comes and she puts that pitch on your eyes, you wiggle your eyelids, you wiggle them, and so that they're not glued shut. Me ie that sila, when your grandmother comes, pass it on." Thukwia heard them. "Chap cho'it, Emeth, what are you saying?" And the oldest boy told her, "Grandmother, I just told the kids, when you start to dance, to drum really hard." "Oh, Emeth, thank you, grandchildren," she said. And she went over, and as she was getting ready to dance, the younger grandchildren didn't understand the message, so their eyes were glued shut. And she turned around. She said, "Okay, my grandchildren, I'm gonna start dancing now." The oldest boy, he turned and he said, "When she comes in front of us and she's dancing, I'm gonna give you a sign and we're gonna push her into the fire." And the oldest kids were understanding. And she said, "Chap cho'it, Emeth, now what are you saying?" "Oh, I was telling the kids, grandmother, when you start dancing, we'll drum and we'll sing hard for you, grandmother." Oh, she said. So Thukwia started to dance and sing. Emeth, halak stach with tlacha sukailich, staast ila o Emeth, kwaihi iha o Emeth, team chap quishkata. Gawatim chap mochtel flustachwith. Oh, atla Emeth. Hey! Just when she happened to be facing the fire, the oldest child shoved her into the flames. She said, "Thlam thaicha Emeth, thlam thaich Emeth, pull me out of the fire, grandchildren." And the oldest kids that remembered what the oldest boy told them, they were saying, "We are, grandmother, we're helping you. And all the while they were pushing her into the fire. The old lady started to burn, and as she burned, instead of smoke coming out, mosquitoes were coming out. And they say because she was singing when they pushed her in the fire, that's why the mosquitoes sing in your ear. The kids were freed then, and they start making their way home. They start walking. The oldest one picked up the smallest boy and put him on his back. And they start walking down. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know where they were coming from. They didn't know how they were going to get home. But before they knew it, they heard in a distance, "Whoo, whoo." And he said, "You be quiet," he told the younger children. "Be quiet. That's what the Sasquatch sounds like." They all stood there. He said, "I'm going to climb that cedar tree. I'm going to climb to the top so I can see where maybe that sound is coming from." And he climbed, and he could see lanterns and lights in the distance there. And he climbed back down. He said, "I think that's our family. They're looking for us. Our fathers are looking for us." They knew how to make good lanterns those days out of dried fish heads. They'd light them and they'd put them on tall sticks so they could see them walking in the distance as they got closer. And their fathers would yell at them, "Hoo!" And the kids would holler back, "Hoo!" And they knew their fathers were coming to get them. By the time their fathers got them and they brought them home, they had to melt bear grease for the younger children to take the pitch off their eyes. But also in those days, they had doctors amongst our people, and they brought them to the doctors because they wanted to make sure they were okay after being with that old lady and having to put her in the fire. And the doctors helped the children heal from their experience. And so that's the story of Sukhwia. We've grown up hearing that story. I know there's versions of that story throughout the different territories. We always still use that story to tell our children when the mosquitoes come out and when the sun goes down, that means you're supposed to go home. It's time to go home so that you'll be safe with your parents. And that's why the mosquitoes still to this day, if you're not going home, it'll come and it'll sing in your ear. That's Sukhwia, reminding you, go home. Your parents want you to go home. These, oftentimes, people will say you have beautiful art. It's a beautiful house post, it's a beautiful carving, but these were always teaching tools. They were always used by our elders to teach the young people and how to carry themselves. They're really our elders speaking through generations. And so I'm so thankful to my Uncle Rocky for his work. His masks are a representation of what our elders wanted to tell us. I know in Canada, we had 59 different languages, and now today we have 3. It's not just a reflection of language loss that we've had, it's a reflection of culture, but it's through this work, like the work that my uncle has done, that we can still hear our ancestors' voice, that our ancestors' stories and our ancestors are still teaching us through these. These are our teaching tools. So Haichka Siam, I'm so thankful to be able to share my great-grandmother's story.